Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back with another episode. You are in for a treat today because I'm in for a treat. And the reason we're all in for a treat is I have back with me Adrienne Bellehumeur. As you will note from her accent, she is from north of Texas. That's okay, too. She is one of the most interesting thinkers, writers, and pontificators on a wide variety of topics that I don't think get enough play in the compliance arena. We visited previously about a book she wrote on documentation. Yes, it was fabulous. But today we're going to talk about internal controls because you wrote an equally interesting article about design-centric internal controls. So, with that incredibly long-winded introduction, first of all, welcome back. And thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me again.
Thanks so much, Tom. It's so great being on your show. I've learned so much from you over last few years of following you and being on your show. So thank you.
Could you remind our audience about your professional background in your current role?
Sure. So I am a chartered accountant, very exciting, but I'm more of an entrepreneur at heart. I just turned 44. Oh my gosh, I'm old. Wow, how did that happen? But I've actually owned or been self-employed for about 20 years now, and I own a firm right now. We specialize in internal control programs in North Texas, also called Calgary, Alberta, largely focused in on oil and gas clients, but many others. I'm also an expert in documentation, and I train and speak quite a bit in documentation best practice. Obviously, it underpins so much of the compliance internal control space, and it's just a message. I've been on my soapbox for many years, talking about why we need better documentation and why we actually do need to train today's knowledge-based workforce in it, and that's another big part of my work.
Let's talk about your article on design or design center approach to internal controls. Could I start with why did you write this article?
The idea of design centric or putting design first or talking about it is not really new to me. I've been preaching this approach to internal controls for a long time in my business. I've been actually writing about this for a long time, but what a client of mine told me I should really submit something to the IIA magazine. Great magazine, by the way. They have great content. Love the people there. I Why it's so important is that in these large, expensive internal control programs like SOX 404, we are asked the guidance is actually pretty nebulous. It says you're supposed to assess design and you're supposed to assess operating effectiveness. What happens in practice is we jump into a lot of testing, and this part of really understanding what good design work is all about and challenging processes, challenging governance, challenging systems, challenging how we work is kind of skimmed over in practice with the enormous compliance requirements that we have to face. So I've been on this bandwagon for a long time. I do create better design work, and I think there's a lot of factors why it's even more important nowadays. As you see these charts from the FCPA and compliance requirements are going up 3,000, 4,000, something insane like that. Sometimes we can get so overwhelmed in just complying that we forget about how to do good design. And design work is not anything special. It just means really getting the best process for your company. If I can put it in a very simple, quick definition here.
You had I don't want to say provocative, but one of the tastiest openings for an article, certainly around
Oh,
internal
really?
controls, which is, of course, think of design as the cake. So, how do we begin to think about design, and how do you really help someone who may not be trained professionally to think in this way to do so, Adrian?
That's a great question. I'm not going to change the industry overnight. Writing about it and training people is that one first step. To shift people to think about design first, with my own team, we put more emphasis on challenging process than we do jumping in to piles of transactional testing. That's a very simple one way to do it is you just shift the amount of time you spend on certain activities. And I do see this is a challenge in big companies where they're putting a lot of money into just things, but I don't know if they're always testing the right thing because they didn't put the right resource to challenge how process governance systems actually work. So for my firm, really, it's about putting the right people who can do that. And I've trained them through my own methods. I wouldn't say this isn't the way you're trained as a CPA. We actually are trained to look at design and we're trained to look and to test. But unfortunately, in the real world, what happens is we jump way too quickly into testing. And one huge challenge in the real world is that it's easier to find people who test. It's way harder. I'll tell you as a business owner to find people who can really challenge process and tell a client what's more efficient, a better way of working, and what will mitigate risk better is a harder resource to find than it is to find a test resource. Is actually very easy. So that is one part. I'm on my jumping on the soapbox already. One part of the conundrum of why programs I don't think do enough design is because of the challenge of resourcing it. And the world is more complicated in some ways. We have more intricacies of systems, governance requirements every day. Like it is harder and harder to find the right resources. When you do, though, it really, you'll notice, I certainly notice a shift in my clients thinking about internal control work because they really see a lot of value there. All of a sudden, that opportunity to assess design every year becomes an opportunity to make their business a little bit better in the areas they want it to be better in.
Adrienne, in the article, you talked about workshops, and here you discussed having a discussion of the organization's process, how the controls work, and how to make them better. I was really intrigued by that. So let me take a little bit of a deep dive into that one. Is that where someone, perhaps you and your team, would sit down with a client's team, whether that be internal controls, whether that be the CFO, whether that be the internal auditors, whether that be the compliance function, and have that discussion to help prepare you for the audit?
Yeah, that's a great point. So one misnomer about design work is that it's just basically something you sit through with, and I'll use Doc for because that's probably the biggest culprit for this, is that you just sit through and make sure the process hasn't changed with the auditors. Now, unfortunately, if you use that approach, you won't get the real value out of your internal control programs. What you can do is just change. This is almost pre-internal meeting with the auditors. You have to kind of come. You don't lay all your cards out for the audit. If I'm representing a company, you don't air your dirty laundry in the auditors, but you can certainly have discussions before it goes to the auditors about where improvements are to be made. So workshops, interviews, diagramming, effective writing techniques, all these different more creative techniques are all about better design work. In my article, I emphasize you don't always need to do the exact same method. Traditionally, we're taught as CPAs as walkthroughs where you kind of watch the process. That's actually a good technique. I'm not against it, but it isn't always the best technique to drive improvements from your client. You do need your clients nothing fancy about this, just great interviewing skills can open up lots of insight about how a process works. And clients will tell you what they want to improve. And that's where design work really can get juicy and high value is when you change. It's not the only way, but just changing up techniques is a simple way to make your design work fresh. Like certainly our clients that we've had for a long time, we might rotate techniques. One year we're really heavy on workshops. One year we do bird's eye diagrams, which is a great high visual to really look at high level of your processes. One year we might be more into processes. And what happens is people think of things a little differently depending on the technique. So the insight you bring to your clients is always a bit fresher every year as opposed to just kind of this check the box that activity that unfortunately does go on when internal control resources are not trained to change their techniques.
Uh, Actually, I wanted to or when I read that paragraph, it took me a little bit different direction I wanted to explore with you. By having that conversation between the auditors and the internal team, can you begin to build, I don't want to use the word trust, but at least a relationship where the team might say or see, hey, these guys are really here to help us. And they're interested to learn about our process. They're interested to learn about our design because
Mhm.
they're not going to do just what you've said, which is test. They actually want to get behind the language and understand, and then take that knowledge, of course, then test, but then perhaps come back with some improvements, remediation suggestions, or other that would actually make us stronger and the controls more robust. Would that be a fair assessment as well?
And wait, are you referring to external audit? There's always, I mean, sorry, are you referring to external audit or internal? Yeah.
Where you would use these workshops to, as you
Yeah.
said, to help prepare
Mhm.
for the actual audit.
Yes. Now, usually my suggestion is you do these with the internal team. Internal audit is great, or sometimes internal audit and internal controls are linked and sometimes not. So, in general, auditors are involved absolutely for some of them, and that does work. The only caveat with external auditors is they're not necessarily hired to make processes more efficient or effective. So they're not going to, I wouldn't say they're not interested. That's not true. They just do have a lot on their plates already. This isn't a slight on external audit. A lot of the techniques I teach are largely for the internal team. And there is a slight difference, like an internal team, internal control team that's internal, whether even though I'm not an employee of my clients, we still represent internal, are more should be more interested in making the business better as part of design. The external auditors are a little, again, not trying to be a slight, but they're not as interested in necessarily making your business better. And that's where you get a bit of disconnect when an internal audit or internal control team thinks that, oh, we just have to do what the auditors say. That's where usually you don't get as much value because just going along with the external auditor's agenda isn't always in the best interest for making companies more efficient, effective, having process be clearer, things like that. Yeah, that you did bring up a good point there of where I think there is a misunderstanding about design work. Design work is not just about satisfying what your external auditors want. They actually have, in some ways, a lower bar. They want financial statements to be correct. But internal people should have a higher bar where they are actually designed as an opportunity to make things better every year.
So, without a reference to your age, which you have so kindly shared with us, I would opine that you've been in this field for some time. I've
Yeah.
certainly been in the compliance arena since 2007. SOX 404s has been with us for over
Yeah.
20 years. I think internal controls are perhaps even more important now than they've ever been.
Mhm.
And I may be preaching to you as the choir, but why do you think now is a time to review your internal controls? And more importantly, why are controls so much more important now?
Just looking at history, it's SOX 404. So we now have 21, yeah, okay, 21 years of SOX 404. So I would argue internal controls is in a state of complacency. That's, maybe that isn't what you will read in many magazines, but absolutely, I walk into companies and they've been doing pretty much the same thing for 10, 15, sometimes 20 years. So I would actually argue that there is a need to think of concepts like design, just to inject more life into certain programs. Absolutely, there's huge changes in compliance world, huge changes regulatory, but the internal controls, that my argument would be we're actually in a state of reasonable, I don't want to say complacence, we're in a state of stability. So there is a need to raise the bar, challenge what we're doing. One other huge factor is the decrease of transactional testing. In the early days of SOX, even in the audit space, there were way more, even our firm 15 years ago, this isn't a nice word, but you'd have more people doing kind of grunt testing where they test lots of transactions. That is really going away in today's world of automation. You just don't need that low value work anymore. So why internal control is even more important is we live in a more complicated world where it's not good enough to just bring in someone to test 50 invoices. You need to really challenge how internal controls work, how the nuance, how the connections. And that's all boils down to better design. That's really what design is. It's really understanding and bringing it all together. So I would argue the increase of systems, the sort of the state of stability, and then really internal controls as a good foundation for so many other areas that are emerging, like ESG, AI. I mean, I think that the foundation of good control supports all this change going on if done correctly. Because internal controls, it is on a nice cadence. You have an excuse to open the hood every year and say, hey, I think you could do that better. And that's actually a nice thing that I really like. You can come back. You have a reason to come back every year and challenge things a little bit. And that's why processes that fall under internal control programs are typically well managed.
As you said, I'm going to use the word complacency because you used that word.
Yeah.
But with complacency, of course, and we also use stability, they go hand in hand. But how often would you suggest a company really, if not perform a gap analysis, try to determine, do their controls need or have their risks changed? Has the market changed? Are they doing something new? Has the regulators said something new? Do we have a new term, ESG? Do we have a new concept, AI? When should a company really think through that kind of comprehensive look to see if they need to improve or update their controls on an annual basis?
Yeah, I do. I mean, realistically, you can't usually change everything perfectly every year. I'm a big proponent of picking your battles and doing a good job to improve certain key areas. Certainly with my clients, we have areas of focus we focused on. We might have themes for the year. I mean, I'll have a client where we're really focused on fraud for the year, a client we're focused on information management and data. And themes works really well. Areas of focus were almost like mini, I hate to say this, it's kind of like mini audits within internal controls. It really helps because you have a focus to make things better. It realistically, it's hard to improve every process every year, but being strategic about where you focus on goes a long way.
In your article, you use 5 principles or talk about 5 principles you can use to improve and bring new energy to your control design work. Could you go through those and give us a few words on each one?
All right. So number one is think of design as the cake and testing as the icing, as I say, as we've talked about. I think that it's like you have to bake this great cake first. You can't just, and I've seen this mistake many times where we really skimp on design. So I've seen some clients that actually don't do any design work and I just jump right into testing. But really design work, assessing processes, challenging, doing workshops, all these things I talk about to really make them better could be the foundation of your program. Testing is what comes after it. In general, testing is not where you reap as much value. I definitely believe in testing. Don't get me wrong. I'm not anti-testing, but it's usually design work where you do reap the most benefits. Put that emphasis first. The next is assess the organization's level of maturity. Internal controls is not, I mean, there isn't a one size fits all. Walmart's control program is not going to apply to my smaller colleges that we work for or even not-for-profits. I mean, you are always, just like all compliance programs, you're always changing based on the level of maturity. And that's especially, I would say, entry level controls is a great example where we do shift dramatically depending on the stage of the company. Focus on habits, not theory. This is one thing I believe in really strongly. We can get very academic thinking in the internal control space where we're talking about an outlier of a control and all these very academic assessments of deficiencies of problem. I like to think it controls like habits, like brushing your teeth, making your bed, going to the gym. I really like that's things like good access controls, counting your inventory, management oversight over your P&Ls. Like these are all just kind of basic best practices that are like habits like that. So I almost when a control just looks very academic or people are frustrated that they have no connection of why they're actually doing activity, there's usually a problem. So focus on habits, not theory. Support continuous improvement. Again, controls. It's about helping a client along their journey. It's not about, there's a real emphasis in internal controls, which is a bit of an academic concept of pass fail. Of course, I have to report on pass fail, but it's a limited view of the world. It's not full picture. So not all, especially if you're an internal team, your assessment should be a little more on supporting a client through, or your internal company through stages of improvement, not just this very linear pass fail style of work. And that's where you should branch off, be a little different from your external auditors and have a different focus than just fail. And my last one is keep it interesting, I usually say keep it interesting, stupid, KIIS, but they removed the stupid. And so KISS in my world means not keeping it simple, but keeping it interesting. It means, like other parts of your life I won't get into, we have to do things a little differently to get spice into the program, or people will just, it becomes quite flat and loses value. So changing people involved, changing the techniques like workshops, diagramming, interviews, surveys, whatever, are simple ways, not expensive, by the way, just really to add more interesting work into internal controls.
Let me change the focus a little bit to a phrase you used a couple of times, which is back to basics. Certainly, business changes, and you and I could probably point to the pandemic as one of the biggest changes in our careers.
Oh,
Maybe it was SOX, maybe it was 9/11, but at least in the last few years, it's been the pandemic. But we've had changes post-pandemic. And so what I really wanted to explore with you is if we have a new business development, such as the AI or the increased use of data analytics, can internal auditors getting back to basics really use that strategy to help them think through the controls for something that may be new or different?
yeah, that's a great question. I'm gonna answer what I've seen, and I've actually been on the. What I see is a failure of basic information management and documentation, which is why implementing programs like ESG and AI have been more difficult than they should be. I'm gonna get on my nerdy soapbox again with documentation and information management. But I mean, ESG and AI, those are two examples, run off good information and good documentation. And unfortunately, when I say back to basics, sometimes we have the tendency to just chase a bunch of initiatives like transformation. I'm not anti-transformation, but it is one buzzword that we we used to have different buzzwords. We've had streamlining and optimization and business process reengineering. It was like 20 years ago. I'm not the biggest fan of buzzwords overall, sometimes because they skimp over the basics that we should have been doing. And what the basics I'm seeing pop up are just basics of information management. Now, and I really mean basic. There's a lot of very fancy writers on information management, but information management, you need an owner, you need very basic classification at a high level, you need to tell people where things need to go, you need very simple rules on naming and metadata. And and ESG programs can run very easily if you get these basics right. But unfortunately, we have been chasing so many buzzwords for so long that sometimes we've neglected the kind of basics that should be there. So I'm to get on my nerdy soapbox. But this is a very interesting conversation. Actually, my world of documentation and information management and my audit world are kind of colliding nowadays. And audit committee chairs have asked me, "Oh, wait, what do you think of these themes coming up?" I said, "Actually, information and documentation. This is what I've been saying for a long time." So there's actually a renewed interest in bringing that as part of internal control. It's not quite there yet, but maybe it should have been a while ago.
So the Department of Justice is trying to formulate new rules around a financial incentive program for whistleblowers. When
Yeah.
I say new, I don't mean that a financial incentive program for whistleblowers is new. I mean, it's new that the Department of Justice is putting one in place. There's currently one in place from as far back as SOX, but also Sarbanes-Oxley for the Securities and Exchange Commission. Other U.S. agencies and departments have had financial incentive for whistleblower programs, and they're going to be more after the DOJ announces their program. Is there a way to use internal controls to help a company either meet the obligations of a whistleblower program or maybe even to prevent something from being a whistle being blown to the government because you've detected it or prevented it internally and then remediated it before it became a full-blown violation or accounting fraud?
Oh, wow. This is where I get a fancy legal question, Tom. You throw at me. Yeah, no. This is a fascinating rule. I can't imagine having all these false whistleblower claims and people looking for money. I mean, it's bound to happen. But I mean, I'm such a proponent of basics. Like whistleblower programs have been part of the COSO model for a long time. So you are supposed to assess the strength of your whistleblower program as part of internal control. Thus, do I think back to base? I mean, I would hope that some of these like obvious things, I mean, that if you can't prove, if a whistleblower, if you can't have basic documentation to support or deny or confirm some position of the company, I would see that as a challenge. I don't know I actually don't know how it would link exactly to internal controls. I'm such a believer in the basic. Like you and I have talked a lot about minutes, good documentation processes. All these things should support you from a legal perspective as well as just good business sense. We've seen, such a big believer in Caremark and all those other concepts that often boil down to just a lack of common sense that brought through to minutes. But I don't know if we're in practice, I think it raises the bar for internal control programs to address these topics, whether they're going to address it in the depth that legal will. I don't know that yet.
Adrienne, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time.
Oh, boy.
But before we leave, I did want to ask you if our listeners wanted any more information on yourself. We're going to link to your article in the show notes, so they'll have access to your article. But if they wanted to connect with you or find out more information about your organization, what would be the best place or places for them to go?
Yeah, so I'd love to connect with people on LinkedIn or my website is riskoversight.ca. I have quite a few articles on internal controls and governance, risk, and compliance. And I also have a website, bellehumorco.com, which is my documentation, my personal brand. That's where I do my documentation consulting. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
What's the name of your book again?
The 24-Hour Rule and Other Secrets for Smarter Organizations.
So we're going to link to that too. Adrienne, as always, it's just been a ton of fun to visit with you, and I hope we can continue this conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Tom, for having me. This is great.